All right, so today we're diving into this kind of battle for transparency that's been brewing in Pennsylvania. And it all centers around, these mail-in ballots from the 2020 general election.
Yeah, it's a really interesting case, because it kind of brings to light that tension between, the public's right to know what's going on and then the idea of the secret ballot.
Right.
We've got court rulings and, dissenting opinions and arguments on both sides. So it's a real knotty situation.
It really is. So we've
Yeah.
got these two people, Matthew Van Bibber and Patricia Weaver, who are essentially saying, hey, those mail-in ballots are public records, so show them to us. They're using the right to know law, the RTKL, to make their case. But when they went to Allegheny County with their request, they hit a snag.
Yeah, they did. Allegheny County basically said, no way, not going to happen. And they pointed to Section 308 of the Pennsylvania Election Code, the part that's supposed to protect the, contents of ballot boxes from being made public.
Right. It seems kind of reasonable on the surface, right?
Yeah.
Protecting the voting process and all that.
Yeah, on the surface it does. But here's where things get a little weird. The Office of Open Records, the OOR, came back with a split decision.
Okay.
They said, yeah, in-person ballots, the ones that actually go into those ballot boxes, those are protected. But when it came to the mail-in ballots, they basically said, those are fair game. They cited Section 1307 DA of the Election Code, which, get this, says those mail-in ballots are actually considered public records.
So it's like two different parts of the law are talking about the same thing, but in totally different ways.
Exactly. It's kind of like the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Yeah.
And of course, this whole thing ended up in the Court of Common Pleas, and that's where things got even more heated.
So both sides are digging in their heels at this point.
Oh, yeah. The Mellon County was sticking to their guns, saying the election code protects all ballots no matter how people voted.
Makes sense.
But Van Bibber and Weaver were firing back, saying the law is super clear. Mail-in ballots, they're public records.
So how did that argument play out?
Well, they even brought in David Voy, the guy who manages the county's elections division, to testify.
Interesting. So what did he have to say?
Well, it turns out the Department of State had actually advised counties to withhold those completed ballots, for privacy reasons. But here's the kicker. Allegheny County had already let someone look at scanned ballot images in a previous case, the Williamstown case. So they had kind of set a precedent for transparency, hadn't they?
It does seem a bit like a mixed message, right? Like they're trying to protect privacy, but they've already let the cat out of the bag in a way.
Yeah, it definitely shows how tough it is to find that balance between transparency and privacy.
Right.
Voice testimony actually showed how they changed their position based on what the Department of State told them. Basically, they were trying to figure out how much access was okay while still protecting voters. But in the end, the Common Pleas Court sided with the county, keeping those mail-in ballots under wraps.
But I bet Van Bibber and Weaver weren't done yet.
Oh, not even close. They took their fight all the way to the Commonwealth Court, and that's where things really got interesting. The stakes were high because whatever the Commonwealth Court decided would set the standard for the entire state.
So what happened? What did the Commonwealth Court decide?
Well, in a kind of surprising move, they completely overturned the previous ruling.
Wow.
They sided with the people who requested the ballots, saying mail-in ballots are public records and that this trumps the ballot box protection from Section 308. It was a big win for everyone pushing for more transparency in elections.
I can imagine that shook things up a bit.
Oh, yeah,
No.
definitely. There were some pretty strong reactions against the decision.
Like what? What were people saying?
Well, the judges who disagreed with the decision were worried about the secret ballot, especially in smaller areas where it might be easier to figure out who voted for who. They said that this lack of anonymity could actually make people less likely to vote, especially if they're worried about someone finding out who they voted for.
That's a really good point. No one wants to feel like Big Brother's watching them in the voting booth.
Exactly. And this ruling actually brings Pennsylvania closer to states like California and Idaho, which already scan and release ballots publicly.
So it's like a trend towards more transparency in elections.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it's a trend that raises some important questions, about whether we can have both more transparency and still protect people's privacy.
Right. It's like, can you really have it both ways?
That's the million-dollar question. And to make things even more complicated, this whole thing is happening while there are all these accusations flying around about voter fraud. And guess what? Mail-in ballots are right at the center of those accusations.
Seriously. So this isn't just about transparency for its own sake. It's about making sure the elections are actually fair.
Exactly. This is getting really interesting now.
It really is. I'm kind of on the edge of my seat here, waiting to hear more about these voter fraud claims and how they tie into all of this.
Well, before we get into that, let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture for a second. This whole fight over transparency in Pennsylvania really shows how voting is changing these days, you know?
Yeah, it definitely seems like a whole new world compared to how things used to be.
Exactly. We're in a time where voting by mail is becoming more and more common, and that's definitely going to have a big impact on how we make sure elections are fair and how we keep people trusting the system.
Like we're trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The old rules that worked for in-person voting don't always make sense when it comes to these mail-in ballots.
Right. It's like technology and how we do things are changing faster than the laws and the rules can keep up with. And that's what's creating all these new challenges.
It sounds like we've got a real mess on our hands.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated situation, but it's also a really important one to understand because it affects all of us.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're right in the middle of figuring all this out, trying to balance the old ways of doing things with how people want to vote now.
Yeah, and this case in Pennsylvania is like a perfect example of that. It's making us ask some really basic questions about, like, what does it actually mean for elections to be fair?
Yeah.
And how do we balance transparency with things like privacy and that whole secret ballot idea?
It's kind of crazy when you think about it, right? This one legal fight about seeing mail-in ballots is making us ask these huge questions about what democracy even means.
Absolutely. It reminds us that democracy isn't just this, like, set in stone thing. It's always changing, always adapting. And this whole debate about transparency with mail-in ballots is a perfect example of that, democracy in action.
So let's get back to those voter fraud investigations. You mentioned that mail-in ballots were actually a big part of that. What was going on there? What were people accusing each other of?
Well, there were all these allegations about stuff being wrong with mail-in ballots, like signatures not matching, ballots supposedly cast in the names of people who are already dead, and even claims that there were, like, organized groups trying to mess with the mail-in votes.
Yeah, that sounds like a total mess.
It really did. And certain politicians and media outlets were playing it up big time, which just made people even more distrustful and suspicious of the whole thing.
So how did they even investigate all of that?
Yeah.
And did they find anything that backed up those accusations?
Well, in some cases, they actually looked at voter lists, compared signatures, and even interviewed voters and election workers.
That's pretty thorough.
Yeah, and sometimes they did forensic analysis of ballots and voting machines to see if anyone had tampered with them. But even though there were a few cases where things didn't add up, the investigations didn't find any proof of widespread fraud that would have changed the result of the election.
So it was kind of like a lot of talk, but no real action.
Pretty much. And that's why it's important to remember that just because there are a few weird things here and there, it doesn't mean the whole system is rigged.
It's a good reminder to be careful about what we believe, especially when it comes to elections. It's easy to get caught up in all the drama, but we got to look at the facts.
Definitely. And this case in Pennsylvania shows how much power the courts have to shape how we think about and run elections. Whatever they decide here could have a ripple effect all over the country.
Makes sense. So are there any other states that are doing a good job of balancing transparency and privacy when it comes to mail-in ballots? Maybe Pennsylvania could learn something from them?
Well, there are a few different approaches that have been tried. Some states, like Colorado, use something called risk-limiting audits.
Risk-limiting audits, what's that?
Basically, they randomly pick a bunch of ballots and check them by hand against the official count. It's a way to make sure the results are accurate without having to look at every single ballot.
So it's like a spot check, kind of.
Exactly. It's a more efficient way to make sure the election was run properly, and it doesn't cost as much. And it's been pretty successful in Colorado. It's actually made people more confident in their elections.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what about just making all the ballot images public, like what's happening in Pennsylvania? Are there any states that are doing that already?
Yeah, California and Idaho, like we mentioned before, they've got systems in place to scan ballots and release them publicly. They're basically all about that full transparency thing. Anyone can look at the ballots, but they do take some steps to protect people's privacy, like blocking out any personal info.
So it's like total transparency, but with some privacy guardrails?
Exactly. But even that approach has its fans and its critics. Some people think it's great for accountability and prevents fraud, but others worry about privacy violations and that it might make people scared to vote.
I can see both sides, honestly. On one hand, it makes sense to have everything out in the open so anyone can double check. But then again, do we really want every single vote being scrutinized like that? It's Feels kind of creepy.
Yeah, it's a tough question. It really comes down to what we value more as a society. Is it more important to have a completely open system, even if it means some people might feel uncomfortable? Or should we prioritize secrecy so everyone feels safe voting how they want, even if it means we give up some transparency?
It's like a classic dilemma, right? No easy answers.
Definitely. And it seems like Pennsylvania is trying to find its own way, somewhere between those two extremes.
They're kind of blazing their own trail, huh?
Yeah, it's a bold experiment, and it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in the long run. It could have a big impact on how other states handle this whole mail-in ballot thing.
It's exciting and kind of scary at the same time.
For sure. Like
Yeah.
watching someone walk a tightrope without a net.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
But so far, we've been talking a lot about the legal stuff and the procedures. What about the actual people involved in all this? The voters, the election workers, everyone who's dealing with this on a daily basis.
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge part of the story, too. And our sources actually highlight some of the key players in this whole Pennsylvania battle, people whose stories and opinions really shed some light on how complicated this whole thing is.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Sure.
Let's hear about these folks.
Well, one person who stands out is Jessica Gonor. She works in the elections department in Westmoreland County, and she has a really interesting take on the whole idea of scanning every single ballot.
So she's seeing it from a more practical perspective, like what it actually takes to make that happen.
Exactly. And she thinks scanning every single ballot is just way too much, especially when you consider how much time, money, and effort it would take. She says it's just not realistic, especially for smaller counties that don't have a lot of resources.
I can see her point. If there's no evidence of widespread fraud, why go through all that hassle?
Right. She thinks the current system is good enough to catch any problems that come up without having to make every single ballot public.
It's a practical approach, for sure. It shows how sometimes those big ideas about transparency don't always work so well in the real world.
Totally. And it brings up that big question again. Is full transparency, even when we don't have proof of fraud, worth all the trouble? Or is it enough to have a system that can catch and fix mistakes without showing everyone every single ballot?
That's a tough one. Honestly, part of me thinks we should just be as transparent as possible, especially when it comes to elections. It builds trust, right? But then again, if it makes things way harder for election workers and might even discourage people from voting, is it really worth it?
It's all about finding the right balance. Is the potential benefit of full transparency worth the potential risks and downsides? That's a decision each state and ultimately each voter has to make.
And it sounds like Pennsylvania is still trying to figure out where they stand on that.
Yeah, they've opened the door to more transparency, but now they got to figure out how wide to open it. It'll be interesting to see how it all plays out in future elections, you know? Will this lead to more legal fights, or will it actually make people trust the system more? Only time will tell.
While Pennsylvania's working all that out, are there any other people we should know about in this whole saga? Anyone else who's really shaping the debate?
Definitely. There's one guy who's especially interesting, and that's Al Schmidt. He's the current Secretary of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He's a Republican who was appointed by a Democratic governor, which is kind of unique. And he's known for standing up against those attempts to overturn the 2020 election results. But here's the twist. He's actually against making all these mail-in ballots public.
Wait, so the guy who fought against the election interference is now saying we shouldn't make everything public. That doesn't really add up, does it?
It might seem that way at first, but if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. His point is that we need to find a balance. Transparency is important, but he's also worried about protecting voters' privacy and making sure the system is secure. He thinks if anyone can look at every single ballot, it could lead to harassment, intimidation, and might even make people afraid to vote.
So it's not about hiding things, it's about being careful about what we make public.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between transparency and privacy, between accountability and security. It's a tough balancing act, for sure.
This is making my head spin, trying to keep up with all these different viewpoints. But that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting.
It's a complicated issue with no easy answers. But by understanding the different arguments, we can at least have a smarter, more productive conversation about how to move forward.
Totally. So speaking of moving forward, maybe we should shift gears and talk about some possible solutions to this transparency dilemma. We've talked about what some other states are doing, but what about Pennsylvania specifically? Are there any ideas gaining traction there?
There are a few things being discussed. One interesting idea is something called notice and opportunity to object, which one of the judges, President Judge Cone Jubileer, brought up in her dissent.
Okay, hold on. Break that down for me. What does notice and opportunity to object even mean in this situation?
Basically, it means that if someone's ballot is going to be made public, they should at least be told about it first and given a chance to say, hey, I don't want that. It adds an extra layer of protection for voters, so their privacy isn't violated without their permission.
That makes sense. It gives voters a say in the process, right?
Right. It's about empowering voters, making them feel like they're part of the solution instead of just being controlled by the system.
It's a cool idea. It seems like a good way to balance those competing interests of transparency and privacy.
Yeah.
But are there any other ideas out there that might help Pennsylvania figure this out?
Yeah, there are. Another one that's got some support is the idea of developing a better system for blocking out information on ballots. Right now, they mostly just focus on hiding names and addresses. But like we talked about before, that might not be enough to keep people anonymous, especially in smaller areas where it's easier to figure out who voted how.
Right, like if you know someone's the only one in their district who voted for a certain candidate, it wouldn't be that hard to guess who they are, even if their name and address are hidden.
Exactly. So the idea is to come up with better ways to hide information, maybe even using algorithms or AI to anonymize the data. It would protect people's privacy while still allowing for analysis and scrutiny.
That sounds pretty high-tech. But are there any examples of this kind of technology actually being used in elections?
There are a few pilot programs happening around the country, and the early results look good. Of course, any technology used in elections has got to be super reliable and secure, but the potential is there to create a system that's both transparent and protects people's privacy.
That's amazing, right? Using technology to actually increase privacy while also making things more transparent. It's like usually those two things are at odds, but maybe there's a way to make them work together.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on. And it shows that this whole debate isn't really about picking one side over the other. It's about finding solutions that work for everyone, you know?
Yeah, it's not just transparency versus privacy. It's transparency and privacy. It's a tough challenge, but it seems like it might be possible.
It is tough. It means we got to think outside the box, question what we think we know, and be open to new ways of doing things.
And that's what makes this whole thing so fascinating, right? It's not just about the law or technology. It's about how we see democracy itself.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's why it's so important to have these conversations, to listen to different perspectives, and really grapple with these tough questions, because how we answer them will shape the future of democracy.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling kind of hopeful, but also a little cautious. Hopeful because there are some really cool ideas out there, but cautious because the stakes are so high. This is about the very foundation of how our government works.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance. But I think if we approach this with some careful thought, creativity, and a willingness to find common ground, we can build a system that's both transparent and trustworthy, one that protects people's right to vote while also making sure our elections are fair and accurate.
I like that. And for our listeners out there, I think the biggest takeaway from this is to stay involved. Pay attention to what's happening in your state and across the country. Ask questions, challenge what you hear, and make your voice heard. Because a strong democracy needs informed and active citizens.
Couldn't agree more. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. Because this conversation about transparency in elections is far from over. It's an ongoing process, and we're all in this together.
Great way to put it. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the issues that matter most.
Until then, keep those minds sharp and those hearts open.